Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Himera in 480 BC, fought by Syracuse and Acragas against Carthage. A battle that was an Hellenic victory, bringing to essentially Syracuse and hegemony in Sicily. The battle was fought supposedly on the same day as the Battle of Salamis or the Battle of Thermopylae. So basically in summer or very early autumn. We're not sure completely even about properly Salamis and Thermopylae. And therefore it parallels, as you understand, Xerxes' invasion of mainland Greece, right? In this broader Mediterranean picture, where according to the sources, the Carthaginians and the Achaemenids would have essentially carried out a pincer movement in order to crash the Hellenic civilization from west and east respect. This interpretation has been dismissed by some scholars that say that in part what is true, that of course the campaign that brought to the Battle of Himera was fought for political and strategical reasons inherent to the relations existing between Carthage and the Siceliotes, and therefore, it wouldn't have specifically to do with the Achaemenid invasion of the Hellenic motherland. But let's say I disagree, because one of the single most overlooked things in human history is the human capacity of coordination, of communication. And it makes a lot of sense that at the apex of the invasion, the second invasion of the second Achaemenid invasion of Greece, the Carthaginians would move up. Also considering some aspect relatively to properly Sicilian policy, that where the Carthaginians had been called 3 years before, as we will see, by the Ionian exile Terillus of Himera, after his city had been occupied by the Dorians of Acragas, led by Theron. And therefore the coincidence of the years makes a lot of sense, right? And the main sources are essentially for the battle, specifically Diodorus Siculus, Herodotus for other details that are quite important. In fact, the information that Galen of Syracuse, that was essentially the author of the victory, together with Theron of Acragas, these were fundamentally Dorian tyrants that had overrun great part of Sicily, essentially the southeast, right? In anti-Ionian function, mostly led by the Hellenic colony of Rhegion in mainland Italy, but that had invested the Sicilian east, and the other third of the island that was occupied by the Hellenians and fundamentally hegemonized by the Carthaginians, together with other Siceliote cities. The Siceliotes are fundamentally the Greeks of Sicily, called like that not to be confused with the interland Sicans, the Siculi, whatever you want to translate, either the Hellenic or the Latin version of the name, that instead occupying the mainland were wholly different population. As you know, the Greeks as well as the Carthaginians fundamentally occupied just the coasts. The Hellenes had also demographically expanded differently from the Phoenicians that mostly had trade avamposts, like for 45. That's how the Carthaginians had fundamentally created their own dominion at this point in Western Mediterranean. And Galen of Syracuse at this point is the key figure, because it was not just the most powerful man in Sicily, albeit he, as we have just said, wouldn't hegemonize completely, even after the victory of Himera, actually the whole island, the control on the whole island, but also was the most powerful man in Greece, arguably, right? Given that Syracuse was surely the most powerful Hellenic polis at this time, right? Athens and Sparta wouldn't have the same. And consider that at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks didn't field more than 40,000 men. As we will see now, the same Galen had offered the Syracusan support to the mainland Greeks with an army of more than 20,000, right? And this, the Battle of Himera is fought in this context of the development of the so-called tyrannies in Hellenic Sicily, with that were something very different politically, socially, and hence militarily, as we know, Clausewitzianly speaking, from the Hellenic motherland, in a very important way, right? Because as we explained a lot of times in our videos about Hellenic warfare, what we know as, for example, is Hopeletism in its idealization fundamentally, because there was never like a battle or an army that was completely like we stilicize the perfect picture, if you want, the ideal picture of the two Hellenic phalanxes, essentially just with infantry all thickly packed, choosing the battleground, and then just crushing all together, with fighting with overarm grip, spear all compressed. That's basically a picture now that is increasingly being debunked further and further from the so-called Reganian Hopeletism in the 70s and in the 80s, that fundamentally was written by a generation of scholars that were scared of hand-to-hand combat because of the defeat in Vietnam, and had to exemplify the Hellenic world as the democracy in a modern sense, and the citizenry in a full sense, and no militaristic or warlike tendency in the Hellenic fight. Today we don't talk about this. I realized that in almost 4 years I haven't done a video properly on politic warfare as such. Albeit we discussed often these topics. Now I basically restarted after more than 2 years this series, in fact, about Hellenic war, let's say classical Hellenic warfare. All this for saying that what was happening in Sicily, but you can see in Greece, even in essentially cities that were not Athens and Sparta. So already, if you look at Boeotia or Aetolia, that hoplitic model gets ever more blurred, right? And you see practically on the field a lot of things, including cavalry, skirmishers, even chariots, as we'll see here in Sicily. There are coins by the time of Galen of Syracuse that show limpidly a chariot here, right? That is with the winged glory flying over it and the horses. It's something beautiful that tells you properly what the aristocratic mentality was there, right? From which the mainland polis had allegedly, detached themselves from, but as you know, the Persian Wars started at the moment in which there were still a lot of property of tyrants, of monarchs in the Hellenic polis, broadly meant, right? So what we read through Athenian or Spartan lenses is something very different from the rest of the Hellenic world. But naturally, since they were more preeminent, like in power and also historiographical production, we got to think that all Greece and its colonies were like that. And naturally, the further from home, the more this differentiation. In Sicily, you can argue that, you see, in the moment in which colonies were founded everywhere in the Mediterranean, that was automatically not like we see in mainland Greece, right? So, already new enemies, different grounds, properly also a different social construction that was, if you want, an emergential one, because these settlers arrived in areas that were already populated. They had immediately to fight to open their path in this territory. The Greeks were not really interested in a broader territorial control, like we couldn't, the obsessive compulsive Roman-led grabbing, the systematic subjugation. They were mostly content with having a city with a control, with surrounding countryside, and mostly being connected in trade, naturally extending hegemony. Sicily is very evidently so, like over other cities, etc., but never quite having a dramatic impact in the interland. And this is quite important also to understand the military cultures of a lot of people that were at close contact with the Greeks, but never quite, were never Hellenized in a deep sense, aside from, maybe their elite would purchase Hellenic panoplies, things like that, but absolutely not fighting like that. We made videos about Roman archaic warfare, also about the Trajan being dressed up like being armed, kept like a hoplite, has very few to do with actually fighting like a hoplite, or what we supposed actually a hoplite would fight like, because individualism was much greater than we think. Even as we were saying before in the Hellenic motherland. So from this battle, we get some info of that. Like, it's a very early clash, as you understand. There are not particular details, so we will include also the campaign story in the in the description. But we see, for example, the importance of cavalry in among the Siceliotes and etc. That is already something you don't find in mainland Greece at this time. And I believe, as we were saying before, the coordination actually between the Achaemenid and the Carthaginians is wholly possible. Right, it makes a lot of sense, not just because of the connection at the time. The Phoenician motherland of Carthage was under Achaemenid control. There was a friendly relation. The Greeks were a bit the common antagonists, as the Phoenicians basically was Carthage that took up arms against the Greeks in the previous centuries for the first time, leading the Phoenician resistance to Hellenic colonization ever since the Greeks went as far as west as Spain in their colonization, and therefore, at least in the Western Mediterranean, maintaining this preeminence against, however, a way more and increasingly intense Hellenic colonization of Sicily, that, as you know, was by far one of the single most fertile, if not the most fertile land, at least in Western Mediterranean. Just Egypt, I can't think, and a bit modern day Tunisia being able to compare in that sense, and also a very developed one. Urbanization, but also through Hellenic colonization, was going on quite fast, and the military power, as we have seen, of the Siceliotes was really remarkable. So the background in here is. We could digress, but let's say that the most important aspect is that the Galen of Syracuse and the construction of his personal power as a tyrant. He was from Gela in the east of Sicily, territories that had been also invaded by the Ionians of Rhegion, and he managed, as his family line had done by harassing the city, to actually becoming tyrant of Syracuse. That was a Ionian city that, however, through literally ethnic cleansing carried out by Galen, and the affirmation of his own personal power was incorporated into this broader Dorian alliance. That was further strengthened by political ties with Theron of Acragas, who was also a Dorian city that had managed to extend. Acragas is in the south of Sicily, Syracuse in the southeast, most of the eastern side. Theron of Acragas, tyrant of Acragas, had managed to essentially seize on the opposite end, in the northern coast of Sicily, across the island, the city of Himera, stripping it from Terillus, was a Ionian, was allied in that sense with Rhegion, and that formed at this point an axis in alliance with Carthage. The Ionians sided with Carthage together with the Hellenians, that actually in this campaign they wouldn't side with Carthage, but to stamp the Dorian aggressiveness of Galen and Theron, so Syracuse and Acragas. There were, as we were saying before, also in this process, tyranny is, as you know, it's like dictator for the Roman. Like it's it's a term that we adopted in modern terms as like the worst thing ever. At the time was actually just descriptive of a form of government, a tyranny as a monarchy, fundamentally. And that was naturally different from the average that had been established, especially in the Hellenic motherland, in most cities at some point, with this kind of allegedly democratic asset that was relatively more, in fact, egalitarian in the sense that, however, in Sicily, it wouldn't hold or much for those reasons of unity of command, of military coordination, and many other Siciliote polities had fallen into the hands of these tyrants that therefore had a multi-city government. And certain Siciliotes at that point would side as well with Carthaginians further, even if they were Dorians, etc., they were firmly connected because of fear also. There was a ferocious struggle between within the same Siciliotes. Cities razed to the ground, as we've seen, deportations, etc. So this is a bit the background, and the Battle of Himera was fought essentially because of the response of the Carthaginians, led by the Suffet Hamilcar, against Himera, that, as we've seen, had fallen into the hands of Theron of Acragas. And in this whole process, like, plans were being made, mobilization, the same, as we've seen, the same Ionians had called the Carthaginians in the island, and they would answer 3 years later. Surprise, surprise, the same year of Xerxes' expedition against mainland Greece. So there is a lot of it makes a lot of sense in connection, because the Carthaginians were looking forward to they had been active in Sicily, right, and they were looking forward to extend further their control, and they had been somewhat frustrated because of the resilience of the Siciliotes, with whom also they had to ally and interfere. So if Xerxes had conquered Greece, definitely the Hellenic, the Siciliote police would have also considerably lost a lot of contacts, of connections. It would have unavoidably fallen in the orbit of the Achaemenids and the Carthaginians. So it was a Carthaginian interest to exploit the Hellenic weakness at that point, and there is a beautiful passage from Herodotus that tells how fundamentally the Hellenic bond, let's say the Hellenic link between the mainland Greeks and the Siciliotes, had brought to the Athenians and the Spartans, in the face of the Achaemenid invasion, to ask for Siciliote support, right? They sent envoys that requested Galens to contribute with troops. Now, there was an inherent attrition and competition and antagonism between now the mainland Greeks and the Siciliotes, because, as we've seen, very different views of what power would have had to be, and properly different interests at that point. The Greeks were more projected, the mainland Greeks were more projected towards Asia Minor. That's all. They had triggered the Achaemenid response. The Siciliotes were, within the island, the Sicily, and dealing with other problems, fundamentally considered that Darius, that was an exiled Spartan king, a few years before, had fundamentally gone to Sicily trying to establish a tyranny, and had died in battle against the Carthaginians. Well, he was nonetheless that Leonidas' brother, right, who died at the Thermopylae, and who wouldn't actually care even to go to Sicily to avenge his brother's death, right? And there was, it's literally two parts of the Mediterranean that are not necessarily driving apart, but let's say having different views from the original mode that had generated them. And in fact, in Herodotus that may have gotten this from very close sources to properly a transcription or a hearing of the same Galens' speech, that apparently was a very good orator, tells us that the Syracusan tyrant had offered to the Greeks 20,000 hoplites, 2,000 archers, 4,000 horse and 2,000 skirmishers, and 200 warships, an enormous army for Hellenic standards, and plus full provisioning for the combined Hellenic forces in Greece, at the condition that he had been made supreme commander of all the Hellenic forces. And the Spartans rejected this, the Athenians as well. Actually, Galen went as far as saying, okay, well, I content myself to get just, I don't know, the command of either the Hellenic fleet or the Hellenic army. The Spartans wouldn't accept any land overlord, let's say. The Athenians wanted to keep their fleet under their own control. So so the events of the war with Salamis, Thermopylae here are probably parallel to the Battle of Himera, according to Hellenic sources, for a reason, aside from the trick here that Galen enacts and all the other, the shrewdness of Hellenic, say, spirit against the barbarians, right, the horde, etc. But as a matter of fact, even Hamilcar was half Syracusan himself, right? And there were a lot of intersections and connections in this sense, for not saying that simply many Greeks were, willing to be Achaemenid subjects, as they factually had already been for a long time. And this was the massive universal empire you couldn't quite escape, especially if it was just across a relatively small, short stretch of sea like the Aegean one, and so much, in fact, that Gelo, essentially being, Gelo requested that much because he was probably worried of the Carthaginian invasion of Sicily. That, as we'll see, was something very serious also when, with full force, say, was available for the Dorians. But while things were going on, Gelo sent an embassy in the east that would be ready in case of Xerxes' victory over the Greeks to provide, for formal the acceptation of the Achaemenid rule over Syracuse itself, right? And this is kind of normal. Imagine like Greece being wiped out by the Persians. At that point, you have the Carthaginians from the other side. At that point, it would have been a very clever thing, probably very well accepted by the Achaemenids as well, that would have at that point set foot even in Sicily, at least as a projection of their power, to counter the same Carthaginians. It might have become concurrents at that point with the same Achaemenids in terms of naval maritime control, as instead, given that the gap left by the Hellenic maritime power would have been filled probably by the Carthaginians themselves. So this is the picture. Now, speaking of the Carthaginians, Hamilcar is said to have assembled an army numbering 300,000 soldiers from all over the western Mediterranean, from Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, Italy, Gaul, and Africa. And this is a bit typical of the Carthaginian army. We made a video about that still in this early time. And some of the most famed mercenaries of the ancient Mediterranean came from these areas. The command of the army was naturally was under Carthaginian officers, and was properly a city army plus the Libo-Phoenician troops. We're talking also presence of chariots at this point, as we've seen, were still there. 200 warships and 3,000 transports for the venture. Right now, these numbers are clearly inflated. Probably the Carthaginian army wasn't much larger than the one of the Siciliot coalition. Also, we know that the Carthaginian army had no siege engines, and the Etruscans and the Libyans, that had been allies of Carthage in past struggles against the Greeks, were not part of the expedition as well. The objective was to recover Himera. Right, we don't know whether the Carthaginians were up to a siege. As we've seen, they lacked engines, and that's a quite important aspect, because those are not things you create from scratch, actually. as lots of, properly of Carthaginian military history shows, also in the following centuries. But it's possible that as we'll see, there were further complications, and that Hamilcar was rather hoping for the Siceliotes to confront him in a pitched battle, right? Which also would prove the fact that the Carthaginians themselves knew that the Siceliotes were consistent in number. The composition of of both armies actually is relatively speculative. We know, of course, it was cavalry, infantry. Actually, the Carthaginians, as we will see, lost much of their cavalry, if not virtually all of it, during crossing of the Sicilian Strait between Africa and Sicily, and that's not also much of a good beginning. Telling the truth, this was recognized by Hamilcar, that feared the gods of the sea would protect the Siceliotes. There's all a thing with Poseidon also connected properly to the horses that, as you know, were connected to the sea god, that we will see in a while, because they lived by thinking that such connections. But we can speculate on its composition by analogy. The Carthaginian army at this point had a relatively active citizenry compared to later centuries, so that formed what the Greeks would call the Phalanx, albeit being just a thickly packed, heavy infantry formation like such, with relatively well-off, well-equipped, Carthage being a merchant city, having a lot of material wealth and so on. Then lots of these subjects, clients of the Carthaginians in the form of Libo-Phoenicians, that were mostly equipped with the Longicae, javelins / spears, small shields, etc. The Libyans would bring on their chariots. The Carthaginians had themselves still at this point. There were Iberians, as we understand, even though the sources say also from the south of Gaul. So there were also Gauls, Sardinians. The latter two would, also with the Iberians in general, they would have fought in their native gear, but they would have often been also equipped by Carthage, that was dramatically wealthier than them. And there were good mercenaries, their infantry especially. Speaking of this, the Siceliote army, we know of a number of 5,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry fielded by the Syracusans alone, right? So this is also an exaggeration. Surely Syracuse couldn't field any of that, would have been, but it's such a number means that it was the full Syracusan force mustered. In fact, we know that Galens would also levy, took out a loan from the citizens to found his war forts, right? This probably also summed up multiple cities, right? Not just Syracuse. There were allies coming from elsewhere, from Sicily, from mainland Italy, and even from mainland Greece. Consider the joint here maritime, the joint adventure, let's say, and the connection by sea that is naturally much speedier and safer actually than one on land, often considering the times and places. And there would be many mercenaries as well, mostly fighting as specialized, mostly archers, slingers, and cavalry, right? Some of the finest cavalry came from horses that were used by the Athenians later on. They came from southern Italy, from the Apulian plains, and so in Sicily there was a lot of that, as we see also in coins. So that's a bit not the typical politic armies we were seeing at the beginning of the video, but speaking for this, in fact, more organized, more tactically diversified and structurally organized army compared to the Hellenic motherland, right? And we don't know how many troops instead Akragas brought the field, because Theron had at this point marched with his troops in Himera, knowing that the Carthaginians were approaching. And so his army was there, but they were too few to face the enemy. They were at that point they were waiting for the Syracusan aid, right? And that's how the thing basically started, right? In fact, Amilcar might have had at this point some opportunities at hand, such as sailing to Selinus. That was one of those Siciliot cities that actually had accepted Carthaginian overlordship, trying to escape the orbit of Acragas, against which, in fact, Amilcar could have directly sailed. Right, Albaidi, in fact, was the closest to Carthage itself. Instead, he went to Himera. The Carthaginian fleet, escorted by 60 triremes, sailed to Panormus in the north. So, well, we're west of Himera. And Himera is also the name of the river that is the name of the city, and this northern river, that there is an homonymous one in the south of Sicily, that is the most famous, that at least the one, if you Google, you will find info about the northern one. There's a few, but in fact, not to be confused with that. The main objective of the expedition was to seize Himera's control, at least to restore Terilus of Himera's government in the city. A victory against Syracuse in open field against Acragas, etc., would have probably extended dramatically Carthaginian control over the island, right? Not conquering it at all, but still emerging fundamentally as the major power in there, replacing the Dorian one. And however, the Carthaginian fleet was battered by storms at sea, right? And as we were saying before, the ships carrying the chariots and horses sank. And this is not good, right? Because in combined arms tactics, you need cavalry, and especially also if you want to carry out a siege, if you want to forage, while the army is sitting there, you have to effectively have such flexible units for that guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics that are carried out in the countryside. The Greek fleet that was present there, it could muster 200 ships, did not contest the crossing. In fact, it played no part in the coming battle. So I will keep saying the numbers are how they are given by the sources, but bear in mind that 200 ships is a bit too much. Anyhow, Amilcar eventually landed at Panormus. He spent there 3 days to reorganize his army and to repair part of the fleet. And eventually the Carthaginians marched east along the coast, the northern coast of Sicily, to Amer, with the fleet sailing alongside, so bringing provisions, etc. And he encamped somewhere near the city, probably west of the river mouth. The city of Himera stands on a hill over on the right bank, right? And Theron at this point was already present in the city with his army, right? But he wouldn't interfere with the Carthaginian operations all along. And there weren't also other allies joining the Carthaginians at this point, like the ones of Selinus or the ones of Rhegion, right? And they would never join later on. Right now, the city of Himera sits on top of a hill that is 300 to 400 feet high on the western bank. Actually, before I was wrong, on the Himera River, right? So. And there is no river between the Carthaginians and the city, right? And the city fundamentally is protected from all sides except by steep, cliffs, except from the south, where instead the slopes gradually descend. And the Carthaginians erected 2 camps near the city. One on the coast, north of Himera, surrounded by a palisade and a ditch, right, while the army was billeted in a separate camp to the south, on a low hill west of Amer. We don't know exactly where, but presumably like in the face of the city, right, to try to block at least. You understand here that without cavalry, there are few ways, and we don't know of any surrounding of the city, of siege work started. No, it was just the army sitting there, and at that point probably hoping to put pressure on the city by devastating the countryside with infantry. Just with that, at some point at this point Theron's forces were not able to counter numerically, right? So, but being pervasive in the destruction, cavalry devastations are carried out by infantry, while cavalry essentially watches over them, right? And because they spread all around the countryside, while cavalry sits there, and of course contributes to bringing the loot back and all this stuff, but it's there to prevent somebody attacks infantry while it's scattered and vulnerable because it's not information. And we know, however, that the land and sea camps were joined by siege works, right? So there was some important precautional connection that here Amilcar put up with some engineering capacity to maintain a link between the two camps. And this is a cautious attitude, because as we were saying before, this guy has no cavalry, has no siege engines, and he is there to do something against it. It's obvious that he's preparing for an enemy attack, whether or not. Even if we don't have any explicit info about that, it sounds a bit logical like it. In the meanwhile, Carthaginian ships were, say, going back and forth, dropping off provisions at sea camp, right, and going to Sardinia and Libya for getting more supplies. 20 triremes patrolled the sea because they feared an Hellenic attack. And the rest of the ships were instead beached in the sea camp, right? And as we were saying before, Himera was not fully invested, but the east and the south sides were fundamentally open. At this point, Hamilcar led a picked body of men on a reconnaissance mission and defeated the Hellenes in a pitched battle outside Himera, right? So these were Theron's forces that for some reason had set forth, and we can't see here exactly what we're trying to, because we don't know more about this operation. However, this attitudes, Theron speaks for some activities. It's good not to leave the initiative to the enemy, to always up to something, but the Carthaginians had the upper hand. So basically Theron had Himera's gates, west gates, so the ones facing the Carthaginians, blocked, right? This made the morale of the troops within the city fall, while the Carthaginians at this point were foraging all over Himera territory and making a mess to cultivation, all this stuff. At this point, we know that Theron sent messages to Galens, who arrived with his army and encamped across the river. Naturally, the thing was already, I don't know, it's possible that maybe Theron wanted to solve the problem by itself, but such an important military preparation by Galens was evidently something going on from some time, and it was just, calling him at that point where things were becoming more serious, because literally having troops, crossing Sicily also, it costs a lot compared to having them, where they were stationed, maybe already mobilized, but still with easier form, way of supply. So keeping them out there under the weather, Sicilian summer, it also has a cost. So it would be done in time. We don't know also where Galens' camp was. Some think it was basically in the east of Himera, so well protected by the actually east of the city and of the river, and that is as an option. Maybe it was in the south. We don't know. What we know though is that Galens' cavalry that, as we've seen, was present in force, managed to capture many of the Carthaginian foragers, as they didn't have any cavalry protecting them. So this boosted the Hellenic morale, right? And Galen wanted to prove so much confidence by essentially opening all the leaving all Himera's gates open, right? And even creating new one in case he had to move quickly in or out the city for some reason. So naturally, this also speaks for some confidence from the Hellenic side. If the Carthaginian camp was in the west of Himera, it wasn't in the south. Maybe that's where instead Galen's camp was. So there was some confidence that it was easy at least that the Carthaginians would have not launched an attack, but still the Greeks were cautious about the Carthaginian reaction. So probably the odds were somewhat balanced at this point. Now, relatively to the battle, we have Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus accounts. There is something from Polyaenus, etc., but some believe they are hard to reconcile. But Diodorus provides for the more detailed account, and that's usually the version that we, over which we reconstruct the battle. Now, according to Herodotus, first of all, he said that he doesn't give much other information except the Greeks and the Carthaginians started to fight in a pitched battle, right, from dawn to dusk, which suggests a very hardly fought encounter. While Hamilcar watched the battle from his camp and offered sacrifices to Baal or Melkart in a huge pyre. Now, given the spaces, it's possible that Hamilcar could see from his sea camp the one of Amer. It would have been not more than 3 kilometers if we get the positions right. So that's actually if you study ancient medieval battle by other ones, you know that normally battlefields stretched some kilometer, like 3 kilometers is not this huge. It's the maximum distance. Surely, the fact, however, that Hamilcar, according to Herodotus, was not alongside the main body of his army is maybe some indication that the Carthaginians were not so confident. The commander didn't want to expose too much. According to Herodotus, also Hamilcar's body was never found, which had some kind of prodigious character. The Greeks are said eventually after the victory to have erected a monument to his memory where he supposedly died, because they kind of respected him at the end of the day, not just because he was half Greek himself or everything, but that there was some divine connection here to the might of this commander, this ruler, and this kind of sacrifice that, as Diodorus is more explicit about, he would have had carried out of himself during the battle. Herodotus is the one stating that a Sicilian tradition held that the battle of Himera and the one of Salamis were fought on the same day. Diodorus says instead it was Himera was fought on the day of the Thermopylae. Anyhow, the Diodorus version, Diodorus Siculus, right? He's a much later author from Sicily, though, who maybe had access to better information. In any case, the actions of the Hellenic cavalry in countering Carthaginian forages had prompted Hamilcar to send a letter to Selinus requesting the polis to send their cavalry to Himera on a given date that Hamilcar was to offer a sacrifice to Poseidon, god of the sea, and as we've seen, that had revealed adverse at that point to the Carthaginians because of the storm and the wreckage of their fleet, and god of horses. So, and the Pegasus. There are connections with the Carthaginians were obsessed with horses themselves. So the equestrian figure in fact prominently in Carthaginian art representation, etc. And they had, as we know, a very good cavalry for ancient standards. They, especially because of all the great estates owned by the Carthaginian aristocracy that could afford that ultra elite the time to train and the resources to train on horseback and so on. At this point, the Siciliote allies were to send their own cavalry, which also speaks, as we have seen, for the importance of cavalry in Hellenic Sicily. And the reason, however, why Poseidon here was mentioned and properly tributed honors from Amilcar is that as an Hellenic deity, and here I wouldn't bet on the fact that it was just considered as such by the same Carthaginians, but let's say that in this sense it required the presence of the Greeks, right, to office the sacrifice, and therefore to make it more real, to make it more effective for the battle. Now, the interesting thing is that Galen intercepted Amilcar's letter to Selinus, and he planned fundamentally to substitute his own cavalry to impersonate the Selinus reinforcement, right, and infiltrate the Carthaginian camp, while his army would attack the land camp in front of the city. So basically paralyzing the communicator, at least, preventing these forces to rejoin at that point. Because now he knew the date, how the Carthaginians had wished the allies to come. So also this is interesting because it shows that how homogeneous the Siciliotes were at that point, that it would be easy to disguise their own, the Syracusan horsemen for the ones of Selinus, that are not dramatically close, but still they would look pretty much the same. Now, Galen's horsemen, in fact, left their camp on the night before the appointed day. That would be also the one of the battle. And at daybreak, these horsemen arrived at the Carthaginian sea camp and were let in by the same Carthaginians. Now, Galen had sent some troops on a hill overlooking the Carthaginian camp to observe the movements within the same. And once they realized the Hellenic horsemen had gotten in, they signaled Galen the accomplishment of the objective. So this, we don't know whether at the moment the Syracusan army was already deployed for battle, was still inside Galen's camp, right? But it's likely that this was early in the morning, the signal for the accomplished, let's say, for green light for going further against the Carthaginian land camp. So, in a way or another, the battle started as the Syracusans marched around, probably, at least if we presume that their camp was in the east of the city, around the south end of Himera, after having crossed the river, and moved towards the Carthaginian land camp. In the meanwhile, Theron forces stayed put in Himera, right, as a reserve force. They wouldn't intervene. At that point, the Carthaginian army left their camp as well and formed up on the hill, forcing the Greeks to fight an uphill battle. This is important because it tells what also the Syracusan morale was to face an enemy army in such a strong position, right? Normally battles were fought in plains, etc. And at this point, the Carthaginians were already expecting, evidently, the enemy maneuvers and had prearranged that position for meeting them. So we know that the battle was particularly intense, right? It was a fierce fight sources tell, as usual, that the combat went back and forth as armies clashed for some time. Then the resistance, the lines clashed for some time. The distance themselves again and again. We don't know about anything about these armies. How many lines were they? What sections, what divisions were. We don't know. We can imagine it was a pretty standard battle, probably with a single line from all sides and kind of with some movement on the flanks. The Carthaginians wouldn't have cavalry, and this was probably a problem for them. But given the strong position on a hill, infantry performed a good task at that point. Probably the Greeks had more gain, but still had the difficulty of the ground. Now, while the battle was going on, we don't know exactly when, the disguised Siciliot horsemen killed Hamilcar in the sea camp while he was preparing the sacrifice to Poseidon or Melkart. Here we don't understand because sources say different things. And some say literally that he eventually threw himself on the pyre of the sacrifice while he was realizing that the battle was going wrong for him. According to me, it was Herodotus, if I'm not wrong. So that's how he banished, let's say, in this kind of this passage from the other side, let's say, to sacrifice himself in the last attempt to save the army, right? And they would do such things at the time. And however, the important is that the Greeks made a mess in the Carthaginian sea camp. Also, they set on fire the beached ships, which was a very good, because even if the battle had gone wrong, at least the Carthaginians would have had no supplies, no way to come back. They would have dispersed just and they could have not done anything against Himera, even if it had been garrisoned by a few defeated forces. We also don't know what further role the Siciliot cavalry played during the battle. Whether it's seducing to think that naturally after the destruction of the Carthaginian sea camp, this cavalry was employed to attack the rear of the land camp, right? And the rear of the Carthaginian army that was fighting against the Syracusans. There should, in general, yes, this cavalry had probably very good elements, but as elite, the majority of it would be kind of medium cavalry, lots of light cavalry as well. And I don't think, maybe some units had the discipline and the training. The Siciliot armies here had fought in the previous years that were battle tested, were good troops in that sense, but let's say how much discipline in order it would have in cohesion to be able to fight again, right? Considering here that it's speculative. We simply have no information about the whole thing. It's obvious that, say, cavalry contingents here were not particularly numerous, quantitatively speaking, compared to infantry. So if the Siciliot cavalry had the upper hand in the Carthaginian sea camp, surely because there were few troops there. So while it's possible that this cavalry could have successfully attacked the land camp, right, we simply after this thing, we simply don't know, right? We have no information, and also how Diodorus continues the story makes us think that they may have not intervened, right? In the mess that happened, this sounds a bit like the battle of Marathon, right? When the Achaemenids tried to run for the ships, but some were destroyed, etc. And the Carthaginians rushed to launch whatever ships they could save, and some of the ships that were crowded with soldiers managed to leave the Sicilian coast altogether, right? And when the news of Amilcar's death and the burning of ships reached the fighting armies, however, this brought awoke among the among the Carthaginian army that was deeply dispirited, while the Syracusan pressed harder and routed them. The Carthaginians, so that's all we know about this. The Carthaginians, however, fled to their camp their land camp. There is also an alternative version by Polyaenos that tells something about the sacrifice, but it's not so important. It's kind of also probably fictional. Well, it doesn't say anything interesting tactically. If not that there were archers in Galens' army, but it's a bit more sort of skip this because it's not even relevant. However, the fight was not over because the Syracusans managed to follow the Carthaginians within their own camp and to storm it, scattering the tents for loot and all these things. However, a component of the Carthaginian army reformed, and these were the Iberians, the famed Iberian mercenaries, who counterattacked the now disordered Greeks who had dispersed within the camp. That's very important because in all this, always remember, cohesion is everything, collective training is everything. The Iberians were good ambushers, light kind of / assault infantry, right? Very lightly armored, equipped with small shields, but very good cutting falcatas, swords, and they were champions of hit and run tactics, right? So they were ready there, probably not just because they had taken refuge somewhere near. We don't understand whether properly within the camp or around. And while the Greeks broke their phalanx at that point to enter the camp, they counterattacked, and at that point in single combat they had the upper hand over the hoplites, that even though they were much more individually, especially in a place like Sicily, let's say, capable than we usually think, even to fight with swords, etc., where couldn't match in 1-to-1 non-information with barbarians such as the Iberian tribesmen and so on. And in fact, they suffered severe casualties against the Carthaginian mercenaries. Now, the Greeks did fight back, but they were hard pressed by the Iberians, who basically were almost able to rout them in turn. So, understanding the critical situation, Theron, that naturally was observing the events from Himera, decided to join the battle. And in fact, he directed his troops against the flank and rear of the Iberian troops inside or around the camp, and also set fire the tents near them to smoke them, essentially. Being smoked in the Sicilian summers, it's not a good, it's a pleasant experience, especially after a day of fight and psychophysical exhaustion, right? So the Iberians finally gave way. They retreated to the ships and still afloat. And there were other Carthaginian survivors who had left the camp and retreated on a hill inland, where they attempted to defend themselves, but since the hill was devoid of water, they were forced to surrender. I mean, literally, you can't really do anything else. So, as we get from the sources, the Carthaginian army was annihilated. Like, about half of them were literally either killed or captured. The majority of the Punic fleet was destroyed, and especially numerous prisoners and rich booty had fallen into Siciliot hands. And further, at least Diodorus says that Carthaginian ships were sunk in a storm on their return journey to Africa. So Poseidon had really something against them all, and it shows the broader risks of these operations in the first place. Now, so you understand that this was a major Hellenic victory, and in fact the Carthaginians for 70 years, apart from an obscure clash in 454 BC, wouldn't offend the Greeks of Sicily further, right? And this victory triggered the rise of the Siciliot tyrannies further in the domination of the island. The Carthaginian defeat was important as we've seen from tactically, operationally was ruinous. Strategically, probably it prevented, through that victory, as we've seen, the Carthaginians could have secured a very advantageous control over the island, right? However, in defeat, the Greeks didn't interfere more than much. They probably wanted simply to continue, without too many problems in their own lives, including trading and so on. So Carthage actually paid 2,000 silver talents as an indemnity for the war, and it erected 2 monuments in the memory of Himera. Yet it lost no territory, de facto, not even in Sicily. So Selinus and Rhegion here were, as we've seen, the major opponents of Syracuse and Acragas, came to terms with the enemies, so much that the Galens' brother, Theron I, married the daughter of Rhegion's tyrant, right? So the status quo before the battle was reestablished in a sense, except Terillus wouldn't essentially, in fact, recover the government of Amer, and Hellenic culture thus spread further as trade flourished in the island, right? Galen, Theron, and Yaron built public buildings using the slaves and spoils gained from the battle, the most important being the Temple of Victory in the ancient city of Himera that is still present in its bases and becomes one of beautiful monuments together with Acragas, Selinus, etc. In Hellenic Sicily. So prosperity in a sense began, but as we know, as richer powers get, they also become more warlike, and in fact say that the Ionian and Dorian feud, let's say, for the control of Himera never fell. At the end of the day, in 409 BC, Himera was destroyed in the so-called Second Sicilian War, because, by the way, this is the one of 480 is part of the First Sicilian, so-called historiographically Sicilian War, for the rest, up to that point, Himera had remained in possession of Acragas until at least 472 BC. Theron had expelled the Ionians after they attempted a coup at some point, settled the city with Dorian Greeks, and by 466 BC, the Siciliotes had broken away from the dominions of Gello, and Theron had overthrown the tyrant's heirs. So, in place of 3 Hellenic power blocks dominating Sicily, that were the ones of Syracuse, Acragas, and Rhegion, 11 let's say Hellenic commonwealths came into being by 461 BC, and this naturally had increased the broader stability of the system, but still from the standpoint of many resources channeled also in war, etc. So this is an interesting account. As you understand, the earlier in military history, the less information, right? And about this battle, we know very few, tactically speaking. But the accounts are relatively coherent, if not with themselves, because they tell different things. But given the relative obscurity of the broader information and situation, they tell something plausible, right? There is no reason to doubt, aside from the exaggerations in the numbers, of course, that are always revealing in a sense. There is a clear picture of this Carthaginian bad luck since the beginning, that naturally was interpreted as for the favor of the gods towards the Greeks, and apparently the same Amilcar recognized at some point of the story of the sacrifice, etc. That may have been made up in a sense, the sacrifice of Amilcar himself, of the etc. But in those times they would believe such things actually, and we don't have the Carthaginian version of the story, as we don't have Carthaginian sources relatively to basically anything they did, so who knows what they thought about that. They would have left us if they had documented it. Let's say, however, it's an interesting battle that shows, especially from the Cycloid side, in fact, this characteristic difference from the Hellenic motherland, the power that had acquired, the tactical articulation that the local armies had acquired compared to the ones of mainland Greece, and the antagonism existing between the two areas, and the relative lack, let's say, of interest, right, with one another, aside from this broader koiné, this broader connection with the common culture, the origins, and so on. Evidently, these were worlds that were diversifying, right, and going towards different directions. And we already made, by the way, a video about the Carthaginian-Syracusan clash, which is the Battle of Tunis of 210 BC. I have to re-upload them with better graphics, let's say, but it's there for listening, and that tells in a very different context, more than 150 years later, but these clash. There were 5 wars and of this kind, and they were all particularly intense, as you understand, and they show this dirtier war compared to what the Hellenic motherland had been used before the Persian invasions. That, however, during the Peloponnesian War, and eventually with the further expansion of the Hellenic world, to which the same Cycloids in this sense contributed to, because there was always some exchange, the local warfare changed a big deal. We made a video on the Battle of Pylos and Sphacteria that tell even in there how things could change and how much diversified were also in mainland Greece since an early time. But we will keep talking about the Persian wars and classical Hellenic warfare and so on, and naturally lots of other things. For now, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.